when you can start by saying Islam is a different thing to 1.57 billion people. And from that general point, you can reduce it to what is it that unifies them. And ultimately, you will get to the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran, the Hadith, the Day of Judgment, the belief in the Day of Judgment. And if you take those three concepts, then it's far from a religion of peace. Because you look, first of all, not only at the content of the Quran, in context, fine, I'm willing to contextualize it, but what if other believers are not and they're influential? What if I want to read Muhammad's practices simply as a matter of history, another great figure in history, but more Muslims, millions of Muslims don't want to do that, right, and really want to follow his practice. What if more and more Muslims invest in the hereafter more than they invest in life? Then we have a problem. And that's why I ask you to vote against the motion. It cannot be only a religion of peace. Because if it were only a religion of peace, if it were perfect, why would we have this debate?
Douglas,
why would we be talking about reforming it?
Can you be 15 seconds?
Succinct, I promise. Yeah. Majid's trying to imply that the whole extremist problem is a sort of misreading by engineers and literary critics. Unfortunately, that's simply not the case, hasn't been historically in Islam, and isn't now. Ayatollah Khomeini, who Ayan mentioned earlier, was not a self-trained engineer, rich boy like Bin Laden, unfortunately, and managed to hurtle a very developed, distinguished culture back in time in 1979 and hurtled this country back into the state it's currently in under these cloaked dictators. Okay. The Grand Mufti of Egypt is not a self-taught, and yet he taught people the other year that all Muslims should go and fight the Israelis with Hezbollah.
Sorry, on Khomeini, I acknowledge Khomeini is a trained theologian, and the fact is he came in the 70s, Douglas, and that proves something. What was he so famous for? Khomeini was recognized for bringing a revolution in Shiite theology. And what was the revolution? Those of you who've studied this will know that the revolution was that up until him, Shiites had been avowedly religiously secular because they believed no one had the right to rule in God's name until the Messiah came, and let them wait for that Messiah until the end of time. Khomeini changed that and turned it on its head. And if that proves something, it proves one thing, and that is it was not consistent with Islamic Shiite tradition. What he did was a very modern revolution, influenced by his studies in Europe and influenced by modern European fascism. He broke from tradition, and that's why it was called a revolution. He was not a continuance of Shiite tradition.
It's the fault of the Europeans, in other words. It's external.
No one's saying...
Remember the victim statements.
Seriously,
Zeba, I want to ask you something about reforms for Islam. Does Islam need reform?
It needs a renaissance. It doesn't need a reform. Reform in the sense, and the reason I say that is because we have to be careful of our terminology. If we say reform as in Reformation, we're thinking of a Christian context, where you had the Protestants and Martin Luther rejecting the Catholicism and the Pope. But the thing is, in Islam, there is no Pope. There is no centralized authority. So there can't be a reformation in that sense. What there needs to be is a return to genuine Islamic principles, which have been not studied, have not been enforced, and are forgotten. So it's not exactly that.
All right.
But a return to genuine Islamic principles is exactly what Al-Qaeda is advocating.
No, that's not actually what they're... No, that's actually incorrect.
A return, a rebirth,
Al-Qaeda, so the difference between Al-Qaeda
is exactly what all those extremist organizations are.
The radio cannot make sense of two voices, and I'm talking now, too, at the same time. So I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to make that point, and then I want to hear back. So think 20 seconds.
When you look at the extremist the organizations that we've come to call extremist, what they're advocating when they answer the question, what went wrong? We had this empire, we lost it. How do we regain it? Their answer is a rebirth. Let's go back to the origins, a revival of it. Is that what you want, Zeba?
No, they actually covert the language for their own political purposes. Al-Qaeda is not calling for a return to Islam or to original Islam or anything like that. They're actually using Islam as a cover for their political grievances. When you look and ask Muslims, ask 1.5 billion Muslims, when you look at the mainstream, they're 90%. They're peaceful and fine. When you look at the politically radicalized, when you ask them, what do they fear most? They say Western domination and occupation. But when you ask mainstream Muslims what they fear, they say economic issues, unemployment. There's a clear difference. And so they're not, what we can determine from that is that it's not religion, because religiosity between the two is indistinguishable. How pious they are, indistinguishable. It's the one factor that makes the difference is what they focus on and their grievances against, perceived grievances against the West.
Douglas Murray.
But don't we get back to one of the core problems which you still haven't addressed, which is the life of Muhammad and his teachings, which is as follows. Is that if a Christian group decides to go back to the teachings of Christ, you know, the worst stuff they find is the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. They can find one verse where Jesus is said, I think the Gospel of St. Matthew, to have said, I come not to bring peace but a sword. But the rest of it is all love thy neighbour and all that sort of stuff. If you're a Christian group looking to go back to the sources of Christianity, you just find a lot of, well, hippie stuff for a lot of modern people. So what is it about this religion we're talking about tonight that you say is a religion of peace, that when people go back to the origins, they find a founder who was violent, teaching violence?
See, this comes back to what you mean by people going back to the origins, and I refuse, as does Zeba, and as we're asking for all of you to do, is to refuse for Islam to be hijacked and monopolized by the bin Ladens of this world who want to tell you what it means to go back to the original sources. Now, if that was the case, then I ask you, why is it that in Bangladesh, where there was a free and fair election, the Islamist party lost roundly? They completely lost the elections. In Pakistan, where there were recent elections, the Islamist alliance in the north that came to prominence after the occupation of Afghanistan, they completely lost all their seats. So the Muslims in two of the most populous Muslim-majority countries in the world, as is the case in Indonesia, whenever they have a chance to vote, they do not vote for the Islamist extremists. And time again in elections across Muslim-majority states, they have proven that their interpretation of Islam, and they are the majority, is not the interpretation of Douglas, Ayan, and bin Laden. Now, I don't want to be in that camp.
All right. I want to take a little break and move on to the topic and the status of women in Islam. I'm John Donvan of ABC News. This is an Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. We're at the Skirball Center for the Performing Arts in New York City. Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace. We have two teams of two arguing for the motion, Zeba Khan and Majid Nawaz, and arguing against the motion, Ayan Hirsi Ali and Douglas Murray. Here in the West, one of the issues that is very complicated for people in coming to terms with what they think Islam is the status of women in Islam. I'd like to go to you, Zeba Khan. Take that on. You know what I'm talking about.
The perception is that for a lot of people out looking at the Muslim world, Muslim majority countries, is that Muslim women are somehow, they aren't, they're subjugated, that they don't, to a point where they are intimidated to ask for their rights and to demand them. But that's not the case. I mean, when you look across Muslim majority countries, if you look at Iran, for example, where there's zero gender gap in education, by the way, men and women enjoy the same amount of education. Obviously, when you're at that level of education, you're aware of what your rights are and what you are demanding. And so, you know, in Iran and places like that, they are demanding their rights. They are pushing for them. In places like Afghanistan or Pakistan, where the gender gap is larger, that gap obviously needs to be filled. But there are women who are pushing there as well. It's not. It's women that are stepping up and taking the lead on this.
Other side response? Ayan Hirsi Ali.
Well, when I try to define Islam as a religion there is expression. What you find in the Quran is expression after expression, verse after verse, and also in the Hadith that women are subordinate to men, that they have a guardian, they need to have a guardian. Their testimony is worth half of that of men. They can only inherit half of what their brother inherits. When it comes to sexual offenses, women are the ones who get, in reality, where Sharia is implemented, and that is not only the practical side of Islam, but also the fellowship side of Islam, everywhere where Sharia is implemented. And there are more places in the world today where Sharia as a family law is implemented, where it's not implemented on a political level, but in all of those places you see a subjugation of women. You see honor killings. You see women who are denied education. If you look on a global level, the levels of illiteracy among women in the Middle East is appalling. That's not something that I'm telling you because I'm, whatever, I misunderstand Islam.